They should have been like, let us sit down and calmly discuss the relationship dynamics here, but instead they end up deceiving each other and hitting and killing each other. Hi, my name is Rebecca. In this video I will discuss the opera Lady MacBeth of Mtsensk by Dmitri Shostakovich, and more specifically the relationship behavior of the characters in this opera. Even more specifically, I will give them some relationship advice or suggestions as to how they could have solved the issues in their marriage in a more constructive way. Earlier this spring I watched 23 operas on a screen. This was related to my current research. The operas were all part of the operatic canon, the opera repertoire, meaning the historical operas that are performed repeatedly at opera houses all around the world. This repertoire mainly comprises operas composed in the past and has become to some extent standardized. This repertoire does not represent the history of the opera as such. We do not have most of the works, the scores from the 17th century, and a lot of the scores of the 18th century have been lost too. The space of listening to an opera has changed too. The ideal of timeless music, in the modern sense, came to exist later than the earliest operas. So, this canon and the idea of what a musical work should be has partly been constructed and standardized later, especially during the latter part of the 19th century. Yet the content of these operas is sometimes presented as universally relatable. It could be an attempt to make the operas relevant from today's perspective. Program notes sometimes describe the characters' inner conflicts as being relatable, something that concerns our human beingness in general. At the same time, the operas were all created in specific eras and also by certain groups of people whose perspective is present in how the narratives and characters have been defined. Plus, there are lots of historical conventions behind the operas. For example, national romanticism has affected the expectations of certain opera composers who have received the role of branding a national identity. But let us consider some of the general topics that seem to be present in opera. One of the most central ones is romantic love, passionate love, the inner conflicts regarding passionate love. These ideas seem to be part of a shared matrix of ideas in our collective cultural imagination. But does this make the ideas valid or natural? Is romantic love, as it is presented in both opera and popular culture, healthy or is it unhealthy? Is it mature or infantile? Is there something natural about it, or could it actually be part of a cultural pathology? When I watched the 23 operas, one after another, almost one opera per day, one of the things I paid attention to was that, on average, the opera characters are not very good at relationships. They mess up a lot. It is almost like watching a horror movie where you want the main character to pay attention to the killer in the shadows and run, and you're like, watch out, they're right behind you. In operas, you're like, no, please just take a moment and do not choose that toxic individual just because of their good looks or the magic of the moment. Or, come on, you don't have to kill yourself because of this situation, just give it a minute and try to process it. Or, think long-term about this relationship. There are things you have to talk through before making long-term life decisions. The opera characters on average are obsessive, they are jealous, and they are reactive. They cannot differentiate between toxic and healthy behavior, and they sometimes idealize toxic behavior. They think that the person is just wild at heart. No! They likely have a full-blown personality disorder. Further, the characters lack resilience, the ability to wait, observe, and navigate a situation in a mature way. Many of the operas idealize passionate love. Sometimes the characters even fall in love with an image of a beautiful person, which is very similar to teenagers having posters on the wall and idealizing a pop star. They are safely projecting their fantasies onto those images from a distance. Only in opera, they actually go after that person, and this behavior is even considered brave and passionate. I am not trying to present myself as some kind of relationship guru, But let us assume that the opera characters are actually real human beings. Most of us do better in relationships than the opera characters. As a footnote, the history of the opera is very diverse, and depending on the genre, not all opera characters were meant to be relatable. Some operas are comedies. Some of the earlier operas were meant to be morally educative. But most of the characters, regardless of the genre, are quite bad at relationships. We don't find many good role models in the history of the opera. Let us have a look at today's topic, Lady MacBeth of Mtsensk. My source for a lot of the context is the book A History of the Opera by Caroline Abbate and Roger Parker. This is the book A History of the Opera. And some other sources online with specific information about the acts. And I watched the actual opera on a DVD. The opera is divided in 4 acts and 9 scenes. An act is a larger portion of an opera. Often there are intermissions between the acts. Acts are further divided into scenes, which are more related to plays, the opera's settings. The total length of this opera is about 160 minutes. The libretto was adapted from Nicolai Gedda's Lady MacBeth of Mtsensk district, but with some changes. This opera came to exist in a time when Russia, or at the time the Soviet Union, was searching for its operatic identity. The operas that were composed at the beginning of the 20th century were quite diverse and did not have one musical style. After the revolution, starting in 1917, Borges-sounding opera was a bit out of date, at least for the new leadership. Yet the actual working class did have, to some extent, Borges' taste. Thus, composers did not have clear guidelines as to how their operas should sound. From this atmosphere, the music of Shostakovich came to exist. The original story of Lady Macbeth was a novella, a short story, or actually a horror story, where everybody around Macbeth dies. The opera libretto is written by Shostakovich and Alexander Preis in collaboration. The opera was dedicated to Shostakovich's first wife, physicist Nina Varzar. In the opera, as Abbate and Parker point out, Katerina's killings could be viewed as killing the merchant class in the society, yet they also write that it is not so simple and the opera is not merely a political argument. So, what happens in this opera? Scene 1 in Katerina's room. Katerina is unluckily married to Zinovy, a flower merchant from the area. Not flower, but flower merchant. So, Zinovy is from the merchant class. Katerina complains about her loneliness. Her father-in-law, Boris, is displeased with her because she hasn't given the family a child. But she says it is because Zinovy can't give her a baby. Boris does not believe her. Mushrooms are introduced as a subject early on in the opera. Boris really likes to eat mushrooms prepared in a certain way, and later in the opera he gets poisoned by them. Boris is worried that Katerina will take a lover, so on some level he must believe her when she says that Zinovy is low on libido. He makes Katerina promise that she will not commit adultery in front of a religious icon. In the first scene, the servant Aksinya also tells Katerina about a womanizer called Sergei who works in a bank. Scene 2 takes place in the Ismailov garden. Sergei and his buddies harass Aksinya, the servant. Katerina gets involved. She criticizes him for his macho attitude and claims that women are just as tough and capable as men. Sergei wants to prove her wrong by wrestling her. Okay, here it seems a bit unclear whether they are flirting and joking or not. Katerina falls down and Sergei falls on top of her. The father-in-law Boris arrives. They claim that she stumbled and he tried to help but fell down too. Boris is suspicious. He tells the people to go back to work and wants Katerina to fry mushrooms for him. The mushrooms again. He also threatens that he will tell Zinovy about her behavior. Scene 3. Katerina's room. Katerina gets herself ready for bed. Sergei knocks on her door and says that he wants to borrow a book because he cannot sleep. What a bad excuse. Also very strange to knock on someone's door with such an issue when he doesn't even live in that household. But Katerina does not have any books. She can't read. When she tries to close the door, he forces himself into the room and tries to seduce her. He more or less forces himself on her. Later she tells him to leave. But he won't, and in the end she agrees to have an affair with him. Okay, so here Katerina is reinforcing negative behavior. This is the same person who harassed Aksinia earlier the same day and who obviously has a very unhealthy sense of entitlement. Does Katerina believe that he will eventually, suddenly start to respect her boundaries? Boris knocks on the door to make sure that Katerina is inside. Then he locks the door from the outside. So Katerina, an adult person, is locked inside her bedroom during the night so that no other man than Zinovy may come in and make her pregnant. But now Sergei is locked inside with her and they make love again, or they do it again. Katerina is obviously very young and lonely, and she does not have any good role models around her. She cannot even read and find information or fiction that could offer outside perspectives on her life. Good decisions do not rise from that kind of space of lack of awareness combined with loneliness. Let's move on to Act 2. Scene 4 begins outside in the garden. Boris, the father-in-law, can't sleep because he's worried about intruders or thieves. He reminisces about the time when he was young. Since his son Zinovy cannot give Katerina a child, Boris thinks that maybe he should seduce Katerina. He walks in the garden when he sees Sergei climb out of Katerina's window. He captures him and then he beats him as a thief. He locks him up. Katerina witnesses all of this but cannot get out of her room. When she finally manages to climb out of her window and wants to go to Sergei to let him go, the servants stop her from proceeding, following Boris's rules. Boris asks Katerina to make him some food and says that he will continue with the beating the next day. He also sends a message to his son Zinovy that there are troubles in the house. When Katerina serves mushrooms to Boris, she puts some rat poison in them. Boris reacts to the poison and dies. When his death is close, he calls for the priest. Katerina gets access to the keys and goes to free Sergei. When the priest arrives, Boris attempts to tell him that he has been poisoned and points at Katerina. Katerina acts like she is crying and tells the priest that Boris is dying from accidentally eating poisonous mushrooms. She recites a prayer next to Boris's body. So, Katerina kills Boris, who had locked her up at night, who wanted to torture Sergei and who obviously was very self-centered and entitled, and he even had plans to make Katerina pregnant himself. Without determining what is right or wrong, let us not judge Katerina too hard on this one. Scene 5, in Katerina's room. Katerina is together with Sergei. Sergei says that their relationship must end because Zinovy will inevitably come back home and Sergei wants to be married to Katerina himself. Katerina says that they will be able to marry but does not say how. This is slightly strange. Does she already have plans to kill Zinovy too? Sergei falls asleep. Katerina is bothered by the ghost of Boris and cannot sleep. Then Zinovy comes back home, informed about his father's death. Even though Sergei is hiding, Zinovy sees his trousers and guesses that someone is there. Katerina and Zinovy argue, and Zinovy hits her with his belt. Then Sergei comes out of his hiding to confront Zinovy. Zinovy tries to call the servants, but Katerina and Sergei stop him. They strangle him with the belt, and Sergei also hits him with a candle holder. They hide his body in the wine cellar. Okay, so Katerina and Zinovy should have had a discussion about their issues a long time ago. They should have been like, let us sit down and calmly discuss the relationship dynamics here, but instead they end up deceiving each other and hitting and killing each other. Katerina is obviously showing very poor judgment going after a man like Sergei, but Zinovy should also have informed her before they got married about the fact that he would likely not be able to keep Katerina happy in bed, nor give her a child. Maybe they could have made some arrangements. She could have had a lover but kept it very discreet. Or, if there really was the need for a child in that marriage, perhaps a third party could have been involved and Zinovy could have adopted the kid. Another question is why Zinovy wanted to marry Katerina in the first place and what his particular intentions and needs were. If they would have discussed the situation trying to find practical solutions, then maybe they could have developed a friendship over time and an over-average happy marriage. Let us have a look at Act 3. Scene 6, near the wine cellar. After Zinovy has disappeared, he is assumed dead. Katerina and Sergei prepare for getting married. That was quick. So they don't want to get to know each other a little bit first. Katerina is nervous about the body in the wine cellar, but Sergei tries to calm her down. They are heading towards the ceremony, but one of the inhabitants breaks into the wine cellar and finds Zinovi's body. He goes to the police and informs them about the body. This is quite messed up. They are getting married while the body is still in the wine cellar. At this point we could start to suspect that Katerina is not that naive. Obviously she lacks remorse. She does seem to fear the consequences a bit, so she's probably not a sociopath, but she moves very quickly from one situation to another, perhaps constantly bored and in the need of stimulation, and she does not seem to be that worried about the killing itself. Scene 7. So, the person who broke into the wine cellar arrives at the police station. The police officer is disappointed that he was not invited to the wedding. When the inhabitant arrives, the police officer considers the situation a possibility to get revenge on the couple who are getting married for not inviting him. So, the police officer is punitive, egocentric, and corrupt too. Everyone is a dirtbag in this story. Of course, the police should arrest someone for being suspected for murder, but here they seem to be making the arrest for the wrong reason. Scene 8. At the wedding party in Ismailov's garden. Everyone is drunk. Katerina realizes that the door to the wine cellar is open. She and Sergei try to escape, but the police arrive. Act 4, Scene 9. At a temporary convict camp, apparently in Siberia. On her way to this convict camp, Katerina bribes a watchman to be able to meet with Sergei, who is also convicted. So she still wants to meet with him. Sergei blames her for everything. Of course, he only forced himself into her bedroom, assaulted her, and participated in killing her husband. Now, Sergei actually tries to seduce another convict, Sonietka. She wants a pair of stockings or pantyhose in return for sex, it seems. Sergei lures Katerina to give him her pantyhose so that he gets to sleep with Sonietka, and then he gives them to Sonietka. Sonietka and other convicts tease Katerina, and she ends up pushing Sonietka out into the river, and in the process she falls into the river herself too. The current is strong and they can't be saved. They are swept away by the current. This story seems to be originally based on literary realism as a genre. It shows darkness and corruption without any ray of light. Everyone is corrupt. One peculiar thing about Katerina, Lady Macbeth, is that she is depicted as not merely a victim or an angel, nor is she depicted as merely terrible and manipulative either. She doesn't fall under these typical cultural gendered projections. She has some actual agency. She makes conscious and even radical choices in a world of corruption. But she makes bad choices. It would be different if she made these choices to escape her difficult position in the social hierarchy and the abusive people around her. But she actually seems to be escaping loneliness and boredom. She chooses short-term passion. This is typical of operas of the Western tradition. Passion is often depicted as the primary value or something that forms the inner conflict within us. Yet it is a quite infantile type of passion, and it does not seem to have much to do with love. It is rather about getting high on an idealized version of someone. In this sense, the opera characters are love junkies. Much of this infantile passion is also found in popular culture today, in romantic movies. Maybe we are culturally conditioned to romanticize harmful behavior. As mentioned in the introduction, perhaps it is part of a shared matrix. Any choices are okay as long as they are romantically motivated. But is this actually a compensatory function? Could it be to escape a dull and numb life that does not have much other value? And because of the lack of value and ethical purpose, we naturalize this toxic behavior and call it part of human nature. This topic is to be continued. Thank you for watching. If you liked the content, please consider subscribing to my channel.